And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution.
This particular show is of high importance to us because we have as our guest tonight Dr. Tim Ball. And Dr. Ball has been actively involved in trying to expose the global warming hoax. Now we all know that climate change happens as a result of natural forces in our atmosphere. Man does have some impact, but compared to the forces of nature, it's pretty negligible. In any case, we've been trying to get Dr. Ball on for the last 2 weeks. We've run into some technical glitches along the way trying to get him on, but tonight we have him on our call. And we want to welcome Dr. Ball to our show, and we want to also visit with him a little bit about what is going on with this lawsuit with Dr. Michael Mann, who filed a lawsuit against Dr. Ball in Canadian court, and we will get a little bit of an update on that. We also want to talk to Dr. Ball about what's really behind the so-called man-caused or anthropogenic global climate change debate. And what it always boils back down to is that money is always what's behind virtually all of this stuff. And so with that, Dr. Ball, I would like to ask you to please tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and some of the programs that you've worked in and so forth, and that will lead into starting the program.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to add one little bit to your comment about the money. Yes, for a lot of people, it is the money, and people are bought off in terms of what they do. But the real issue is power, and at a certain level, the people that are seeking power, they know the money will come with the power, and then they can use the money to control the people, but it's ultimately about the power. But just a quick background on myself. I was born in England and emigrated to Canada 1957, been able to do in Canada what I was unable to do in England because of the class system that still exists over there, and joined the Canadian Air Force in 1961. I flew anti-submarine and, in fact, was an operations officer of a squadron during the Cuban crisis, and we were on 2-minute alert, confined to the hangar, not just the base. And but that gave me a great insight into the oceans and water temperatures, because that was essential to tracking submarines. And that got me really interested in the whole environment issue. I then was transferred to Winnipeg in central Canada and flew search and rescue in Arctic Canada for 5 years, and that simply expanded my interest in the world and in the environment and nature and so on. And of course, most Canadians and most people don't know that Canada is 4,000 miles from coast to coast, but it's also 4,000 miles from the U.S. border to the North Pole. And I've had the privilege of seeing all of that, and it's unbelievable country in the Arctic. But that got me going on the weather, the failure of the weather forecasts, and the inability to forecast beyond 48 hours with any accuracy. And then I lost my flying category because of hearing loss. And I think that hearing the noise in today's world is a pollution problem we need to be talking more about. But anyway, I lost my flying category, didn't want to fly a desk, took a small cash settlement out of the military, and then went back to university. And I think I went back at the time that everybody should go to university, that is at 30 or older, because the things you learn from high school on require life experience to appreciate. And so what happens is that high school and university simply become a babysitting agency. It really doesn't add much to people's understanding of things because they've got no life experience to relate it to. But anyway, I got interested in the lack of data on climate, the lack of records, the lack of reconstruction of past climates. And in Winnipeg, where I was located, was the 300-year-old archive of the Hudson Bay Company. And they, like all corporations operating in the world, have to be aware of environment and climate issues. And so they kept daily weather journals in a scientific method, using as ships do, recording the weather. But then in 1768, they brought instruments to North America, the first to arrive here in 1768, as I said. And so what I did was I did a doctoral thesis on reconstructing the past climate. What I learned very quickly from that, of course, was that the climate changes dramatically all of the time, and much more rapidly and much more often than people realize. And of course, the other thing that happened was that when I started out, now we're talking about 1970, the consensus was global cooling, that the world had been cooling down since 1940, and the CIA were writing reports on the impact of global cooling on the world economy and so on and so forth. And I was as opposed to that, because they simply projected the trend and said, oh, it's going to keep on cooling. And I said, no, look at the pattern of history. It's cyclical. And then I became as opposed to the pattern of, oh, it's going to keep warming from 1980 on. And that brings us up to today. And I'm still battling with the reality of the past and what it tells us about climate and the claims of global warming due to humans.
Well, you know, that's a fascinating kind of a synopsis of your background, but it's interesting to me, and I think probably to our listeners, that Holdren and Ehrlich, who were two of the biggest proponents of going into a new global ice age back in the early 70s, are now the ones that are pushing, well, Paul Ehrlich, I think he passed on, but certainly Holdren is one of the biggest promoters of the global warming theory and man-caused global warming. And I don't know how they can get away with being so incredibly hypocritical in their thinking, but apparently that's something that happens a lot in climatology. Am I correct with that?
Well, Paul Ehrlich, by the way, is still alive, and unfortunately he's still teaching in a university or having credibility in the academic world. John Holdren, of course, became Obama's science advisor in the White House and was very instrumental in a great deal of what went on. But both of them were instrumental in using climate and specifically using global warming for a political agenda. And this is one of the things that people need to understand, is that it really isn't about the global warming. That's just the vehicle to, as I say, push a political agenda. And the reason that they wanted something like global warming is that they had to have a supposed threat to the planet that was universal. They needed to bypass national, in the individual countries and say, look, this is a problem that needs a world government to resolve, and therefore we've got to establish one world government to deal with it. But their issue wasn't, as I said, it wasn't the climate or global warming. It was that the world was overpopulated. Ehrlich was the author of the population bomb, I believe 1972, and in which they were arguing that they basically took the Thomas Malthus argument, and Malthus was actually he was a church minister who dabbled in science, and he argued that the world would outgrow the food supply. He was completely wrong, but it became very much a theme of science and the political world. But they took his idea that the world would outgrow the food supply and said it would outgrow all of the resources, that the world simply couldn't sustain itself at the rate it was using up the resources. And, of course, that's where you got terms like sustainable development coming in. And they, through the Club of Rome, they published a study by Meadows called Limits to Growth. And, of course, what they were talking about was limiting the size of the world's population and also its activities, because they claimed that everybody was using resources at an increasing rate, even the developing regions, but that the developed regions, the industrialized nations, were using them at an even greater rate, and therefore they had to be shut down. And so, of course, what they wanted was some mechanism by which they could lay the blame on the industrialized nations for impacting the world. Well, as Maurice Strong, who was a Club of Rome member, as was Ehrlich and Holdren, Maurice Strong took that idea from the Club of Rome and set up the United Nations Environment Program and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to focus on CO2, because what they wanted to argue was that these industrialized nations achieved their wealth and their excessive exploitation of resources by using fossil fuels, and that their use of fossil fuels was producing an increase in CO2 that was causing global warming. That's why CO2, which is only 4% of the total greenhouse gases, water vapor 75%, that's why CO2 became the focus. So their real objective is to reduce the world's population and to reduce the industrialization and development. And, of course, the nastiest nation of all involved in all of that was the United States, and that was their target.
Right. And, in fact, I would like to mention the fact that Al Gore Sr. was also a member of the Club of Rome. And yes. That report came out, I'm thinking in about, well, the written report came out in the early 70s, but the actual report of the Club of Rome that led to Limits to Growth was in the late 60s. And yep. I think if our listeners, kind of connect all the dots, it goes back to the very beginnings of the really, really radical environmental movement. It predates the EPA and some of the things that Richard Nixon put in place that would increase government control of the ability to utilize natural resources. And all this is tied together very neatly if you just track the sequences of events and understand that none of this is accidental. Dr. Ball, would you, and I want to get into the lawsuit that Dr. Michael Mann filed against you, but I want you to please explain the hockey stick chart that was created by Mann, and basically all the things that were excluded conveniently, or maybe we can call them inconveniently, all the things that were excluded that really impact the overall picture of climate change.
Well, one of the things that I mentioned a little bit earlier was my study of the amount of change that occurs naturally. And of course, this was one of the problems of these people that were trying to claim that humans they had a clear human signal of humans causing global warming, and then laterally they called it climate change. We can talk about that. But they had the problem of the historic record. one of the charts that appeared in the first IPCC, now the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was set up by Maurice Strong through the United Nations, but it was also done through the World Meteorological Organization, because that meant then that it was run by bureaucrats. And of course, bureaucrats are not accountable to anybody, and they can persuade politicians what to do. So Strong knew that. And they were charged, the IPCC was charged with only looking at human causes of climate change. But before that happened, that started in the 1995 report, they had produced a report in 1990 which included a graph which is labeled 7C. Now, the graph 7C was produced by Hubert Lamb, who was a historical climatologist in England, who I had the pleasure of helping with my doctoral thesis. But the graph showed what was called the medieval, and is still called the medieval warm period. This is a period about 1,000 years ago, centered between 900 and approximately 1200 AD, when the world was much warmer than it is today. And of course, this was a problem for them. This was, it completely contradicted what they were telling the world, that the world is warmer than it's ever been before. And of course, people like me were saying, well, no, hang on a minute. Look at this medieval warm period. How do you explain that? And it's really it's very interesting, because one of the Professor Deming, an American professor, published an article in Science in 1995 in which he kind of said, yeah, well, look, there's some evidence of human impact on the climate. But, of course, he said what you said. It's a minuscule amount. It's of no consequence relative to the natural causes. But anyway, he got an email from one of the people that were pushing the human-caused global warming, and it's believed to be Jonathan Overpeck. But he wrote to him and said, we've got to get rid of that medieval warm period. And in other words, what he was saying was, we've got to rewrite history. Well, how are they going to do that? Well, there was a fellow at the University of Virginia by the name of Michael Mann, who'd been working on a doctoral thesis that essentially did just that. And the interesting thing with Mann is that he used tree ring data to create a graph which claimed that there was virtually no change of temperature over the last 1,000 years, and that was the handle of the hockey stick. And then in the 20th century, there was a sudden and very dramatic upturn in temperature that was the blade of the hockey stick. And they were the ones that labeled it the hockey stick because of the shape of the graph. That man who could not get approval for his thesis at Virginia suddenly went to Penn State, and within 2 months or 3 months of getting there, his thesis was approved, and he was appointed to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And the hockey stick graph appeared in the 2001 report, and as Ross McKittrick from Guelph University said, it became the poster child of global warming, because it showed this dramatic upturn in the 20th century. The problem was that tree rings don't record temperature for the most part. They're about precipitation, but they blithely ignored that. And then he only used one tree ring set, and it was a set of tree rings that the people warned about even using it to represent anything, that it was a biased temperature set not to be used in research or for policy. Yet that's what he used. Two professors from Canada, McKittrick and McIntyre, and McIntyre particularly, whose career was in analyzing stock claims for mining claims, so he knew how graphs and statistics could be manipulated. He saw the hockey stick graph and knew exactly what had been done, and that it was a phony graph. And so he tried to reconstruct it. he found that, of course, it did eliminate the medieval warm period, but then they went to Michael Mann and said, look, we'd like to reproduce what you've done, and Mann refused to release the data. And, of course, that's a fundamental test in science, reproducible results, and Mann refused to test that. Just to step forward a bit with that, so that's what the hockey stick's about. It literally, in very Marxist way, rewrote history. It rewrote climate history. And just to give you an idea of how bad it was, the blade of the hockey stick was instrumental temperature records, which they then grafted onto what we call proxy records, the tree ring data. Well, that's scientifically unacceptable. You can't do that. Right? And not only that, but the blade claimed a 0.6 degrees Celsius increase of temperature in approximately 120 years. The problem was that the error factor on that 0.6 degrees was plus or minus 0.2 degrees. In other words, the temperature, the modern instrumental temperature record they were claiming had a plus or minus 33% error factor. I mean, you wouldn't even use that for a political poll. And so I had given a presentation in Winnipeg, public presentation about the hockey stick, and afterwards I was interviewed about it, and in a flippant remark, I was asked, well, what do you think about Michael Mann? And I flippantly said, well, you know, he's at Penn State. Well, maybe he should be at State Penn. And I got the lawsuit within 12 hours. And Mann, of course, has consistently refused to release that data, the data on how he came up with the formula, the computer code that he fed to the to create the hockey stick. Now, to add to this, sorry to go on so long, but this is so important. Ken Cuccinelli, who was Attorney General in Virginia, sued the Mann and the University of Virginia to release this data. And his argument was that, suing on behalf of the people of Virginia, he said that they paid for Mann's research, and therefore, effectively, the data belonged to the people of Virginia. And that also, Mann had used the results of his research to produce policy through the IPCC that affected global and national energy and environmental problems. The whole thing that's going on now about alternate energies and so on is directly a result of that hockey stick. Well, Mann went to the court to defend himself, found a judge that ruled that he didn't have to release his data because it was his intellectual property. And so that brings me up to my case because he sued me. And he sued me for defamation on my comment. And I went back and said, no, I need those documents in order to prove that I did not defame you. He is now refusing me those documents. So we're now at the situation where he's using the ruling of the American court of it being his intellectual property to deny me the papers that I need to prove that I didn't defame him. So it's effectively a double jeopardy, and that's the situation that we're at right now.
Okay, well, I also, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I also wanted to mention the fact that during the Roman period, there was also a very warm period that, and again, everything is cyclical in climate, but led to much of the expansion of the Greek and Roman empires because of the warmer climate. Growing cycles were better, everything was better, travel included, and therefore this isn't something that's only happened one time with the medieval warm period. It actually has been going on for a very long time.
But exactly, Dan, and there's another period called the Minoan period when it was warm again. But if you look at the last 10,000 years of world climate, a period called the Holocene which stands for the most recent. It is referred to as the Holocene optimum. That is because it was for 97% of the last 10,000 years, it's been warmer than it is today. And I have a photograph of a white spruce tree that's 100 kilometers north of the current tree line. And for the tree to grow to the dimension of this relic tree, it would need global temperatures at least 2 to 3 degrees Celsius warmer than they are today. And of course, the tree, by the way, is radiocarbon dated at 5,000 years old. The interesting question, of course, is then what happened to the Arctic ice during that period of time, and then how did the polar bears survive that warm period? And yet here they are thriving very well today. So when you look at the history, the cyclical thing, but just to add to that, to show how political this all is, in 1990 there was a conference in Warsaw between the East and the West. Now remember, the Cold War is going on. At that conference on climate, the Eastern nations, that is China and Russia, and I've worked with both climate scientists from Russia and China, they were arguing that the climate is cyclical, and that all you have to do is sort out all the different cycles and how they overlap to create the variable pattern that is climate, and then you would be able to predict the climate much better. At the same conference, the Western world, particularly the U.S. and Britain, were arguing that the climate is chaotic. And I teased them and said, you better hope that it's chaotic, because that would help you explain why your forecasts are so wrong. But the media reported that conference and the difference as a political difference of the Cold War. But in fact, it was a very fundamental science difference in what's actually going on. And of course, that's the debate that's still going on in a way. And so this sort of thing's been political. The other thing I can tell you, by the way, is that it was Margaret Thatcher who was the first one to use CO2 as the target of global warming. Now, she since, before she died, said she was wrong, that the global warming due to humans is not correct. But she developed it, and here's one of the great ironies. Lord Monckton, who's been a very, very strong advocate against the human-caused global warming, but he was the science advisor to Thatcher on this issue. Now, right. What they did was they wanted to identify CO2 as a problem because Thatcher was being controlled, and Britain was being controlled by the Coal Miners Union. So she wanted to shut down the Coal Miners Union. She also wanted to get rid of the Coal Miners Union and the coal because she wanted to develop nuclear power. And so it was very convenient for her to demonize CO2, but it was for quite different reasons, nonetheless political reasons, but it was different reasons than the use of it by Maurice Strong later on.
Right. Well, yes, and you're right about the irony of her being one of the strongest proponents initially, and it shows exactly how good leadership recognizes when they're being fed false information, and they change their rulings on that stuff, but it doesn't fit in with the Club of Rome and the limits to growth. And so, that is very definitely a political thing. It was, at the time, they were trying to determine how they could unite the people of the world in a common cause to create a strong move toward global government, and in that, limiting population and limiting the amount of industrialization, because a lot of these people recognized industrialization leads to freedom. And the fact is that a large part of the reason that the United States is now one of the leaders in the world in improving the environment is because of our wealth and our industrialization. And they're trying to take that away, and what they really want to do is deindustrialize the Western world, the Western cultures, so that they can redistribute the wealth to third world countries. Am I right on that?
You're absolutely right, and just to reinforce what you said about the global governance, when Maurice Strong was interviewed for her book Cloak of Green, Elaine Dewar spent 5 days with him at the UN, and she said he went to the UN because he said he could raise his own money from whoever he liked, appoint anyone he wanted, and control the agenda. But also, she concluded after 5 days with him that Strong was using the UN as a platform to sell a global environment crisis and the global governance agenda. And so, yeah, that's exactly what was going on here. And of course, it's where we are today. There's a couple of things that I would add in there too, Dan. One, the use of the word hoax. A hoax, they do occur. I mean, the most famous one in science is the Piltdown Man. This was people trying to claim that we had evolved from the apes, and they wanted to find a link between fossilized primates and humans. So there was this constant search for the link, and this one scientist was so obsessed with it that his colleagues made a fool out of him by putting a chimpanzee skull with a human jaw and aging it and putting it in a quarry, and he found it and claimed he'd found the missing link, and of course it turned out to be a hoax. Hoaxes are done to prick pomposity or to prick arrogance. The global warming issue wasn't a hoax. It was premeditated, it was deliberate, and the damage it's done has been enormous. And, of course, that's the point that you're making. People need to remember that coal has brought billions of people out of poverty and into some semblance of a reasonable life. And extended life expectancy, when you look at the life expectancy increase in developed countries against underdeveloped countries. And in fact, India, the Prime Minister of India is saying, to heck with you. You've got all the benefits of burning coal, and now you're depriving us from those benefits. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to go ahead anyway. So yes, but look at how this all ties together, Dan. You keep mentioning connecting the dots, and I think that's so critical. Darwin published in 1852, and that was essentially the basis of capitalism, survival of the fittest. But Marx's Communist Manifesto was published 11 years before, and that was communism. And those are the only two basic socioeconomic systems we've developed. And so we're really in our infancy in that. But you go back a bit earlier, not much earlier, but the American Revolution. One of the things that Obama did was that he went around convincing the world that American exceptionalism meant that Americans thought they were superior to the rest of the world. That wasn't what it meant at all, and it isn't what it meant at all. And I spoke about this at a conference in Phoenix in December and argued that the Trump election was the final phase of the American Revolution, because the American Revolution made America exceptional because it had free speech as the number one mandate. And the lawsuits that I have are proof that Canada and the rest of the world doesn't have free speech. The Second Amendment, of course, was to defend the First Amendment, because the Founding Fathers knew that your own government was your greatest threat to you. And then the next thing that made America exceptional was private ownership of land. That doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. Canadians think they can own land privately. They appear to own the land, but in fact they don't. The government can come and take it at any time they want. And the third phase, I think, occurred with the Trump election because the Internet gave the people access to information, and the power elites had always controlled the information. And the media, the mainstream media, were the people that worked for the power elite. And in the Trump election, of course, he very effectively, through the internet, bypassed them. Now, I don't think Trump's well read, and I don't think he went quite this deep with it. But he made the comment that people are trying to get him to stop tweeting. Well, it's the mainstream media that are trying to get him to stop tweeting, and his response was, "I'll stop tweeting when they start telling the truth." But I want to read you a poem that was published in 1782, and I want to put that date in with the American Revolution, what's going on today, and this argument that the American Revolution is in its third and final phase. This is by William Cowper, an English poet, 1782, The Progress of Error. And he wrote, "How shall I speak of thee or thy power address, thou God of our idolatry, the press? By thee, religion, liberty, and laws exert their influence and advance their cause. By thee, worse plagues than Pharaoh's land befell, diffused make earth the vestibule of hell. Thou fountain at which drink the good and wise, thou ever-bubbling spring of endless lies. Like Eden's dead probationary tree, knowledge of good and evil is from thee." So you can argue that the mainstream media has always been fake news because they only carry the message that the power elite want to bring you. And so, of course, Trump has completely bypassed that to bring information to all of the people. And of course, that's why you see in dictatorial countries, they ban or try to limit the internet, and Obama was trying to limit it through his plan of net neutrality. He put it forward on the guise of, these companies are gouging you, therefore the government's got to protect you. But in fact, what it was to control the internet and the information it provides for you.
Right. Yeah, and in fact, I have to make the comment that two of the strongest proponents of our constitutional Republican form of government and our historical background are both people from other countries, and that includes you, a Canadian, and Lord Christopher Monckton, who happens to be a Brit. And, of course, you were born in Great Britain, but the bottom line is that sometimes our strongest patriots are people that live in other countries and have the clear vision of understanding how things are in their country and really worship our system of government because we do have opportunities that they don't have in their own country. And I appreciate your comments on that, and incidentally, you and Dr. Will Happer, among others, were at that Third Congress of Freedom Force International at a program called The Inconvenient Lie. And that really was to kind of put the focus on what was behind the climate change debate. And that is available on DVD. Through Freedom Force International, and I would suggest that our listeners, if they are interested in seeing a really interesting and positive debate on what really is behind the global warming scare, I do call it a hoax, but you're right. Technically, it's not. It's way beyond that. But the bottom line is, if folks are interested in learning more about the global warming scare, please go to Freedom Force International and look online, and that Inconvenient Lie DVD is available and would be something that I'd find very interesting. Dr. Ball, I want to talk to you about something we visited about earlier in another conversation, but about the SLAPP lawsuits and how our court system is being manipulated to through jurisdictional shopping to be able to really shut down public dissent. Would you like to kind of fill our listeners in on that?
Yes, absolutely. But again, I'll add to what we've already been saying, because the French Revolution, which they claim was based, the American Revolution was based on, in fact ended up being a failure. In France, as Macron is going to find out, the power elite in France are still in control, and they will block any changes that he wants to do, because Macron is essentially trying to speak to the middle, just as Trump did, and they will block him. But the people in England who first initially admired what was going on with the French Revolution and wanted the same thing there, people like Edmund Burke and so on, of course, they very quickly realized what had gone wrong in France. That the revolution didn't last very long and degenerated into an absolute debacle. But a lot of those people saw the opportunity to move to America, and so much of what went on in America was, I've argued, was actually a British Revolution that they couldn't bring about in their own land because of the power of the elite, and so America as a region gave the land and the food supply, the enormous resource economy to build that political unique country, and so that's why what America was all about was so important, and of course why the British government tried to put it down so forcefully. Canada, of course, is made up of, in the East particularly, people who escaped, didn't want to be part of. They wanted to be loyal to the Crown. And in fact, most of Eastern Canada was made up of people called United Empire Loyalists. And so Canada, we're still stuck with a prime minister that none of us get to vote for, who was a member of a party that was elected by 39% of the population, and only 80% of that party voted for him. So we have no say in our prime minister at all. But yes, back to your point about the SLAPP lawsuits. SLAPP is an acronym for Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation. And one of the things that we need to understand with everything is that everything is a two-edged sword. Everything can be used for good or bad. And, of course, that's the underlying theme of freedom of choice, which America was about, which Christianity is about, and, of course, therefore are threats to people who want to have total control of the individual. And the law was set up to protect people against injustices and being abused or misused by governments and others. And basically, as America is proud to say, we're a nation of laws. The problem, and by the way, one of the ways I used to talk to my students about this two-edged sword is I would point out that nuclear is an anagram for unclear. And nuclear, of course, is one of those things that fits this two-edged sword so perfectly, because the energy potential that it offers is just unlimited. But with the nuclear bomb, and we see what's going on in North Korea, you see the dilemmas that these things create. And the law was set up under the British system ostensibly to protect the individual. Now, I'll give you an idea that there are underlying problems in that, which were corrected by the American system of law. They claim that it's based on British law, and of course even John F. Kennedy was very heavy in promotion of the Magna Carta, what went on at Runnymede, and they claim that was the rights of the individual were protected there. It wasn't at all. What went on at Magna Carta in Runnymede in 1215 was that the king, who was the most powerful of the power elite, of the great landowners like Prince Charles, the king wasn't doing things that the rest of the landowners who let him be king because he was the most powerful, they didn't like. So they got together and said, hey, you're stepping out of line. You're not looking after us properly. It had absolutely nothing to do with the individual citizen, because those lords who forced the king to sign Magna Carta went back to their estates and had all the slaves and serfs who couldn't own property or couldn't do anything and had to pay to live on the Lord's land, continued in that slavery right up until the American Revolution. And so this is part of the whole history of what's been going on. Now, what's happening in the U.S., unfortunately, is that people have found that want to push their own agenda or want to punish other people, because that's how you achieve power. You get power over somebody either financially or in politically. And so there's been an increasing use of the law to shut people up, to silence them. And so the acronym SLAP stands for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation. The legal profession and some of the politicians have become increasingly concerned about this misuse of the law, because they realize the threat that it is to American society. And so I'm not sure of the numbers, but I believe it's about 32 of the U.S. states have passed anti-SLAP legislation. In Canada, 8 of the 10 provinces have passed anti-SLAP legislation. 2 of them, British Columbia and Ontario, did not pass anti-SLAP legislation. Now, to be technically correct, British Columbia passed SLAP legislation, and then another government got in and withdrew it. And so the reason that my lawsuit against Michael Mann was filed in British Columbia was because they couldn't file it in Manitoba, the province where the event occurred. So here we have a man from Pennsylvania, an American, filing a lawsuit in British Columbia in Canada about an event that occurred in Manitoba. And it's what they call jurisdictional shopping, that you shop around till you find a jurisdiction that will bring about the verdict that you want. And, of course, again, that idea completely contradicts the whole concept of the law protecting the individual and having some degree of equality and uniformity within the law. And so these SLAP lawsuits have been increasing, as I said, to the point where even the legal profession are aware of the dangers. But this is something that a society has to be constantly vigilant about. That the founding fathers put in a very basic system that transcended time, that was based upon universal truths, but it also recognized that you would have to be constantly vigilant, and that's why they set up the system of the rest of the world laugh at Americans, say, oh, they're always in elections. Well, yeah, because you know that if you give people power, it won't take long for them to abuse it, and you've got to be able to control that power. And so these are all things that are under attack constantly, but they're particularly under attack right now because of the concept of one world government.
Yes, I agree. And one of the things that I talked about with Mark Morano last week, or actually the week before, was about this group of progressive attorneys general that started a movement in 2016. They actually, March 29th, they met and they formed a group called AGs United for Clean Power, and threatened to file charges against ExxonMobil and other so-called climate change deniers using RICO statutes and their extraordinary subpoena powers granted to AGs under the Martin Act. This is obviously patently unconstitutional in legal terms, and this is the sort of thing that we see happening. If they can't win the debate intellectually, then they call names and they do all this negative stuff against their opponents, and then when they can't do that, then they try to use the law to really suppress any of their opponents' positions at all, and they're using the law in a way that was never intended by the Founding Fathers. Isn't it pretty amazing to you how the left, the so-called liberals or progressives, are the ones that are the first to try to use the law to shut everybody up that they disagree with?
Well, of course, that it is their purpose is that you cannot allow individualism, and that what you try to do is isolate the individual and show them that they are a threat to the greater good, and that's another of those terms that is so misused, the greater good. One of the RICO statute, by the way, that was applied in Senator Whitehouse was behind that, but also the main organizer of it was Al Gore. Al Gore, working through the Attorney General of the state of New York, and I've forgotten his name, but and also through the Attorney General of I think it's the Virgin Islands, who was of great he hero worshipped Al Gore. He got them to bring about this RICO statute challenge, but of course the use of the term climate deniers is a part of this whole strategy. You see, one of the things that you do is that you first, if you can't win the argument on the facts, then you attack the individual. And I know Lord Monkton loves to use Latin terms, and he'd be quite happy to refer to this as ad hominem or to the person attacks. And it's also, so it's a form of argument, but it's a form of argument that you use when you're losing the argument. You attack the individual, so the lawsuits against me, for example, are they won't debate me on the facts, but they bring the lawsuits in order to silence me. But the other thing that goes on, this is more of a modern phenomenon of the left, is to create groups, so that you create a group and you put anybody that's troublemaker into this group and then isolate the group. So, for example, anybody that dared to ask questions about Obama's documentation immediately became a birther. This was a tag that was deliberately created to isolate. Now, whether you can have a collective ad hominem, whether that's an intellectual impossibility, I don't know. But it was designed to, if you dare to even ask a question, you're a birther. Mm-hmm. And they even effectively silenced Trump over that. But what happened with the climate issue was that initially we were labeled as global warming skeptics. And Richard Lindzen and myself and others started to point out, but look, if you're not a skeptic, you're not a scientist. Right. That all scientists, their job is to challenge science and try to disprove it. If it holds up to the challenges, then it becomes scientific law instead of a theory. But then they stopped calling us global warming skeptics, partly because of that counter-argument, but more importantly because they realized that the world had stopped warming. So by 2004, the global temperature had started to level off and, in fact, was declining slightly, but CO2 was continuing to increase. Now, this attack their very fundamental assumption that if CO2 goes up, the temperature will go up. Well, the data was showing that wasn't happening. And this is what Thomas Huxley referred to a century ago as the great tragedy of science, a beautiful hypothesis destroyed by an ugly fact. And so what they did was, normally what science would do is if the evidence starts to contradict what your hypothesis is saying, you go back and revisit your hypothesis. They didn't do that. What they did was they moved the goalposts. They stopped calling it global warming. And by the way, there are leaked emails where they talk about this. They say, look, there's cold periods, and the people are starting to question, how can it be so cold if there's global warming? And they said, will be better to call it climate change. And so starting around 2004, we saw the switch from global warming to climate change. And, of course, they then changed the group into which you were put, so we became climate change deniers with all of the Holocaust connotations of that. And then if those sorts of groupings fail, then they immediately say, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. Well, the trouble is conspiracies do occur, but they've created this idea that the people that are conspiracy theorists are outside the mainstream thinking and therefore lunatics and not to be listened to. Right. So this is all part of the political strategies of isolating anybody that dares to be an individual. And, of course, the whole American nation was set up to defend freedom of will and freedom of thought and freedom of the individual, and therefore it stands for everything that they hate.
Well, I know that the Internet has been a real problem for these people because for the first time in human history, we actually have a way to access facts that is virtually unlimited. And I know that that's one of the reasons that Obama and the UN and a number of people that want to be part of the control grid that controls everything we do are doing everything they can to try to, let's say, shut down or at least limit access to that information through the Internet. And that's why it's so incredibly important for us to defend the rights of the Internet to stay free, because with that, the entire world, not just United States of America, but the entire world can start to learn what the truthful governance of our world is all about, and learn how there are a handful of people that literally want to control everything that we eat, do, see, hear, every aspect of our lives. And that will happen if they figure out a way to completely shut down our access to the Internet. So for that, it's really important that we maintain that kind of
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes this week's show with Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. God bless. Good night. We'll see you next Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific.